Today is the fourth in my series about float designs, and today I want to talk about float tips, the bit that you can actually see. There's nothing very difficult about it. Obviously it needs to be a colour you can see. It's the bit above the water, which can be an absolutely minuscule amount with a pole float that you could dot, or it can be a standard trotting float, something like this. You can see the crow quill there, this red tip, or it can be a standard waggler float like this. Now there's an important principle, or a couple of important principles about float tips. The amount of tip that's sticking above the water has a volume, whatever that volume is, and for that bit of tip to go under, if you got say 1 centimetre and it's say 3 millimeters in diameter, you can calculate the displacement of that. It doesn't matter what that material is, whether it's peacock quill, a piece of beech, or even a piece of steel. And you will see in magazines and even books, oh, it's more sensitive if I use cane that's got neutral buoyancy, and other such complete nonsense. Archimedes was tasked by the king, I've told you about this before, with finding out whether the crown that had been made for him was actually solid gold or a mixture of silver and gold. And Archimedes had this moment of revelation, his eureka moment, which is ancient Greek for "I found it." As he was in the bath, he realised that a solid gold crown, gold was denser than silver and would displace less water for the same weight than one that was a mixture of silver and gold. And so it's exactly the same. So if it's peacock quill, once it's shotted down to a centimetre, or then one small shot will take the last bit down. But if you were to make that out of lead or steel, the same shot would take it down the same amount. But you say, well, if I make this out of a nail, like a 3-inch nail, it's changed the shotting of the float. Yes, it has. And years ago I made this float especially to prove this. This is just a piece of balsa wood, and it's been varnished just to keep it waterproof, and it's got a 3-inch nail with the head cut off at one end, and at the other end it's got a piece of cane that's exactly the same diameter as the steel, and it's got some shot on it. And if you put this into water, a certain amount will stick out with the cane down and the steel up. So that minus buoyancy, that negative buoyancy of that steel, which is 7 times denser than water or thereabouts, is floating because it's held up, because the overall weight of the float compared to the same volume of water is less than that of water. The overall weight of the float, ignoring the shot. So therefore it takes these shot that are dangling off the bottom to take it down to that point, and then one more shot to take it down the last bit. If you reverse this float, take off the float cap and put it the other way around, it's probably lost the line now, put it like that, so the cane is upright, exactly the same amount of cane will stick out as when it was steel. And you add exactly the same shot to submerge the last bit. Now the float behaves differently with the steel down and the cane up. It's now base heavy, it's quite stable. When we had it the other way around with the steel at the top, it's unstable, it's top heavy, very top heavy. So we don't make floats with steel nail tips. You can get pole floats. I've got some 50-odd-year-old ones. I think they're Michel Curo, and they've got an incredibly fine wire stem going all the way through a tiny little polystyrene body, and that steel wire is like fine piano wire, springy steel, very, very fine. It's finer than even the sort of thinnest nylon bristles. It's not the sort of float you use for supporting a bit of sweet corn or a big pellet or anything like that. It's for fishing with bloodworm, joker, a pinky or a maggot. And these floats take very, very little shot, the equivalent of sort of 2 or 3 number 10 shots. They do go a bit bigger, but don't fall into this trap of, oh, I'll change the density of the tip of a waggler and it'll become more sensitive. It will change the shotting though. So if we take this peacock waggler, so it's a piece of peacock with a thinner piece of peacock at the tip, that thin piece of peacock is very light, and so if we were to replace it with a piece of cane, this bit of cane's a bit thin, with a thicker piece of cane exactly the same diameter, because the piece of cane would weigh a bit more, we'd have to take a little bit of shot off the loading for that the float would carry, but the amount that it would take to pull down the last bit, because that extra weight has been compensated in the lock-in shot or the shot down the line by removing a little bit of weight, it still takes the same amount to pull it under. The other thing, the float will, I'll talk about wagglers on a separate video, but this float, when it's shotted up with bulk shot at the base where you could load it, because the trailing part of the float is extremely light, it will fly very, very true. It will follow the weight. If we were to put that steel nail in the other end, it will tend to dip and it won't fly so well. And even with the cane, it will affect the balance slightly, not a huge amount, but it will affect it slightly. So that displacement is important. So like I say, if you had a centimetre, 10 millimeters of tip showing, we can calculate that volume. We can actually calculate how much shot it would need to do it. So it's 10 and then it's pi r squared. Well, pi is 3 and a bit. 1.5, it's r is the radius, so it's 3, half of that, 1.5. 1.5 times 1.5, 2.25 times 3 1/7 is about 7, just over 7. That's an interesting point in that, so we've got 70 cubic millimeters, might be 72, 71, whatever, without calculating it very carefully. If you have a piece of thin peacock, sometimes it's square. This bit isn't exactly round. So if you had a piece of square peacock, and like I say, when you get to the thin bits, it often is sort of square or slightly off. Certainly not dead round. It's, instead of pi r squared, it's just across the flats. So 3 times 3, which is 9 times 10, 90. So it's actually got a greater volume than the round peacock that is 3 millimeters. This sounds all very scientific. But when you sit in the water, there's very little difference in how visible it is. It's fractionally more visible, fraction being the word. But it's a ratio of 7 to 9, so it's more buoyant. Someone will say, oh well, the peacock holds up better than the cane that's perfectly round. So the perfectly round comes up to 70, this comes to 90, it's a little bit more buoyant. So there is a difference. It's a bit scientific, but everything is doing exactly what it should do. It's all as predicted. Just staying on the buoyancy bit, I've been using Resolve float tips. These are quite big ones. These are 4.5 mils, and this one in this float's probably a 3.5 mil one. Over 3 mils, harder to get. I've been getting them actually from Resolve in, I think, Bulgaria. What you might find hard to see is there's a hole in, it's hollow. I've cut the end off because it's normally a rounded end, and I've cut a little tiny scoop out of there and put a little bit of glue on the back just to strengthen it because that's a weak point. And now 1 centimetre of this that we could calculate, it's just the thickness of that shell, that skin, which instead of, like we said, 90 is now down to about 20. So it's something like 4 times more sensitive, but it's just as visible. So if you want sensitive floats, people say, oh, that it won't go through. It jolly well does. However, it works best if the diameter is a minimum of about 3. It's because of surface tension and getting the flow to go through there. But as long as the diameter is 3 millimeters and above, and I've used them up to, like I say, up to about 5 millimeters. And I've been using these floats like this for over 40 years, since the very early 80s, when the idea was first put out there in, I think it's Course Angler magazine, and carbonite floats did some where you had sort of interchangeable tips, and that included hollow ones with a scoop on it. They weren't as bright. These are very bright, and with the sunlight through that sort of hollow tip, they show up better than painted peacock or painted cane. So floats that haven't got the scoop on, and I do make them without doing the scoop. There's one there. There's no hole in the end. You won't be able to see it on there, but it's just an ordinary 3 millimeter tip. They really ping up, so that's more buoyant, that one, because there's no hole. But they really show up in the light. Now you'll also notice on these tips that there's no colour bands. I just have all this very bright red. Very occasionally, for me, I've got normal colour vision. Something like getting on 10% of men have usually red-green colour blindness. So a red float on a green background, and they might see it as a bit lighter. Not many people admit to colour blindness, but 1 or 2 people I've known over the years, and they just don't see that. They would struggle to see that, and the answer for them is to use a yellow tip float that will show nice and bright against a green background, and they can carry on fishing. So if you see someone who's got lots and lots of yellow tip floats, they might be colourblind. The other colour that's important is just a plain black tip, and I do hollow ones of these as well. You can get Resolve black tips. I don't think I've bothered so much. On wide open waters where there's lots of sky there, black is better than red. You'll still see the red, and if the lights go in, then red may be better than black. But black is a very useful colour to have for wagglers if you do those wide open waters on either bigger still waters. Not so much, commercials are often physically quite small, but when you get the sort of reservoirs or rivers like the Thames and the Trent, where you've got that 40, 50, 60, 70 yards of water, not many trees on the far bank or whatever, and a black float. So I've got lots of black tip floats which are all going to fall out there, but you can probably see that some of those are black. Back in the days when I started to get really interested in float making and waggler fishing, I was reading everything I could get my hands on by Ivan Marks and Kevin Ashurst. They both brought out books in the mid-70s, Ivan in 1975, Ivan Marks on match fishing, and Kevin in 1977, world-class match fishing. they had slightly different attitudes. Kevin's attitude on floats was get the diameter right, and whatever colour he could see best, paint the tip that colour. So black or red in his case. Kevin argued that you didn't need colour bands. He said, if I can see red best, then if there's more red sticking out, I can see that. Whereas if it was a different colour, I might not see that I've got a bite because I can't see the other colour as well as the red. Ivan, on the other hand, sometimes fished right across the welland, and he liked sort of bands to see if something had held the float up, with like the zoomers and things like that. And he'd have just sort of a couple of bands. The zoomers sometimes had more bands than that, but generally their floats were fairly straightforward as far as the colours were concerned. But Kevin definitely just black or red, that's it. Ivan sometimes black with a white band underneath, and if he was fishing right across the welland, it would be into the shadow of almost into the shadow of the far bank. But Ivan's eyes and Kevin's were truly exceptional, and although my eyes went, I became short-sighted when I was about 20, 21, and then I got glasses. My eyes before that happened, and then once I got glasses, were exceptional. And you find that with lots and lots of top match anglers at their peak, and even now, their eyes are right up there. They're not the ones who struggle to read a number plate at 20 metres. They're the ones that could read it. I think when I first got my glasses, I could read a number plate at 80 metres in good light. And so people have said they're sat behind Ivan up on high bank, a bit further away from the float, and he's fishing right across, and he's got a float dotted. They can't even see the float, even though they're match anglers quite often. And Ivan's sort of looking out there, he's got no eye shade, nothing. And the float's dotted down, and they said, well, we're not seeing these bites, we can't see the float, he casts it out there, it's out there somewhere. So they did have good eyesight. So colour banding, and I do see people with lots of fancy little bands every 1/8 of an inch and all that, as if they're going to see some. Well, if you're after shy crucians, I'm not going to get into the debate of the lift method today. If you you're not fishing very far out usually. You're only fishing under your rod tip, so you're only fishing 7 or 8 yards out at the most. And you dot a float that's fairly fine tip, finer than, say, something like that. That's about a 2mm one. And you dot that down. Well, if you get a lift bite, it's pretty easy to see it's done that a little bit. If it goes under, it's gone. So you don't need a fancy band. It's on the 3rd band down, and don't need it. Back in the 70s, the type of float I liked using were what Ivan called 2mm antennas. Is a balsa body with a 2mm antenna. This one's been repainted, and I've fined down the tip a bit so it's finer than 2mm. And these floats, you wouldn't use number 8s down line, you'd use a number 4, but about 2 foot from the hook, long hook length, 2 foot from the hook. And the bites show on these, because it's fine, massive lifts and stuff. If you put number 8s on it, you'll tend to get little tiny bites, but as long as that number 4 is a good distance from the hook, it shows well on the tip. I haven't actually got one here, but on Croquil Avons, and that's a classic sort of topper float with a fairly streamlined body. You have quite a bit of tip sticking out. Topper reckon just over an inch. I prefer, and this is for a float not to be held back. It will slow down, but you want it to pull through and get underneath the surface drag. You see quite a difference with a float that's designed for holding back and shotting right down. So it's quite a short tip, barely half the length of that tip, and there's more of a shoulder there. So, and there's just a little bit there that's clear for the float cap. So you can just got that bit there, and you're holding it back, and you may even overshot it. I've started to make these floats with the Resolve tips, generally 3 or 3.5. I've made some gigantic Avon floats. I'll probably never use them with the sort of 4.5 tips. They're floats taking 5 and 6 one shot, sort of at 8 or 10 grams, big floats. But for the roach floats, the sort of 3 and 3.5, and it shows better than a painted crow quill, and these show up well enough. But with the Resolve hollow tips, I don't put any scoops or anything like that in there, because you want that a bit of residual buoyancy. It's a shame they don't make it as shape them like a crow quill, but you know, perfectly done. Instead they're just parallel and then a rounded tip. But if you are making Avon floats, you just want a little bit of crow quill in the base, and you can put a hole in from both ends, and then a Resolve tip in the top. Stick floats have a bit more variation. Ivan Marks used to reckon on a sort of a fairly pointed tip. Pete Warren's floats had a rounded tip. This is actually a John Dean wire stem, ordinary wire stem. Can't find it. This is another John Dean. This is just all black, and that's got the pointed tip, so more sensitive. When people what they called rock hopping on the Trent and overshotting it, then it was easier to fish, and they still dotted these things down. They didn't have much sticking out, and they dotted right down, and we're talking the best stick float anglers who ever walked this earth. So with the pointed tip, it's more the running it at them, just put it in, and it's very slightly retarded going through. Fish stops the bait and it's down it anyway. But when they're sort of overshotting it and holding it back, and this is a Allerton float here that's actually got a lignum bit, got quite a shoulder on it, and a little bit there for the float rubber below the painted tip, and then it'll be shotted right down and held back. So think about the tips when you're making the tips on a stick float or a balsa float. That's a Drennan balsa float with a little bit of plastic at the bottom just to strengthen it off. Again, quite a small tip. I haven't used these for years. They're fine floats, nothing wrong with them. I think that is more or less it for conventional floats. Pole floats are a whole new ball game. Generally, tips that are much thicker because people are fishing for small carp, match carp, whatever you want to call them. The sort of pole floats we used 50 years ago with wire tips and very fine bristles and all the rest of it are used far less. People fishing on rivers with pole floats tend to use bigger pole floats. I've got a nice example there, which is taking about, how many grams we've got there? 3 grams, carp a river, got a big wire stem there and a nice bright bristle, and of course you've got the tremendous control, so you can overshot that and then control how much bristle as you put it through. The skill's got to be there. But there is a place for the fine stuff if you're fishing little baits and it's really tough. I know we practiced once, Team Castle practiced once for I think it was the Sundridge League before it became the Drennan League, and we were in Division 2. There was Division 2, Division 1, and then the Southwest Super League. And all the Super League winners ended up in a Super League final, and all the Division 1 ended up in a Division 1 final, and all the Division 2 a Division 2 final. I don't know about Division 3 and 4 in some places. In the Southwest there was only Super 1 and 2. And we went up to something like Upper Hayford or Lower Hayford on the Oxford Canal. Very cold conditions. Wasn't frozen over, but very cold, very hard. We were only allowed to fish with squats and pinkies, or worms, but we couldn't use bloodworm and joker. And we dotted down tiny little canal floats, taking sort of equivalent of 3 number 10. And we thought we were fairly shotted down, using a couple of millimetres showing. Further along the bank, there was the Birmingham Starlets team were practicing for the Super League final. And I think these matches were often in 2 legs. Ours, I think it was on the canal, and then the Upper River Nene, or the Nen as they call it up there. Where else they fished the Super League final, I don't know. Obviously on the Oxford Canal, possibly on Makins or somewhere. I don't know. We're talking 1991, early 1991. And for some reason, the Super League finalists could use bloodworm on the same water. We couldn't. And we went and watched people like Paul Downs, Mark Downs and so on. And they had pretty much the same floats as us, except we thought we were dotted down. They were really dotted down. And even though they were using bloodworm and joker, the bites were barely shifting, tiny. We're talking a very, very fine tips, a fraction of a millimetre and a fraction of a millimetre showing, and they were just about going under. We didn't catch a lot. The conditions weren't very good because of the cold. I remember catching about 4 or 5 little perch and rough or gudgeon or something. But the starlets, because they had the bloodworm and joker, were all catching lots and lots of fish, and little gudgeon and rough and little perch and things. But it just shows you how dotted down you can be. And so thinking about what the float tip does matters. Floats like this one I'm holding, going back to, crikey, late 80s. There were some floats that came out with papyrus reed bodies and cane stems made by Milo, and similar bristles to this, maybe a little bit finer. Still got 1 or 2. The papyrus bodies were a bit like elderpith. They're quite delicate, and the line would cut into the floats. Used to put a bit more varnish on them, try and stop that happening. And we were used to fishing in good conditions, like I say, sort of balsas like this, or stick floats. And then you went on to a sort of a 1 millimetre on the pole, on the same line, 1 millimetre bristle, just like this, but thinner. And suddenly the bites that you were getting compared to a conventional float, it was just exponential. In other words, for every bite you got on a conventional float, you got 10 on one of these, and you could sort of hold it back and overshot it, and you're watching these bites develop on that pole float tip. It really, really made a huge difference. I probably don't do enough pole fishing. It's not the most exciting thing to watch on a video, but I should have a go on the river a bit more and maybe demonstrate this if I can find some fish to catch. But it really did make a difference. That's it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed it. Plenty more to cover yet. Looking a bit more at stick floats and Avons and wagglers, and maybe something else, some odds and bits at the end. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.